And remind me your name?
Joni.
Joni.
And you are?
Will.
That's right.
Pleasure.
But for me, being in front of a computer means work.
Right.
Because it always has been. And I have a bad attitude about it. I don't want to sit in front of a computer. I got other things to do.
Right.
And I bought a house in January, so I got a whole new garden and planting to do. Clean slate.
Excellent. Excellent.
Well, I did get some stuff in the ground. I bought stuff from the high school. I'm getting tomatoes and zucchinis. I see my little pumpkin is starting to make a flower.
Oh, great. Yeah, I don't. I've got a few things in the ground like that. Not much. Some flowers, but nothing. Nothing actually maturing yet. So.
Yeah.
Hey there. I see we've got one person tuned in. So that's good. Hello out there. This is Will from the Foothill Garden. We're up here live today. We have one guest with us. So, as some of you may know, we were doing these classes in person. Up until last year, and then we started doing the streaming via Facebook. So we are trying to refocus and have the classes live again, get a group up here, and have some kind of round robin discussion, which is something I like. But we're going to continue to stream and do the videos as well. So wait a couple minutes, see if we get any more folks tuning in or showing up here, and then we'll dive right into it. So today's topic to some of our traditional landscape plants, ones that are useful and edible, and really strategies on creating a low. Oh, maybe I'm having internet issues. Is anybody tuned in there? Are we sounding all right? I'm seeing a notification about connection issue, or hold off just a second here. So one of the primary concepts with food forests and these edible landscapes, edible forest garden, is trying to make it low maintenance. So, really choosing things that work together. If something happens to not be edible in the system, hopefully it's going to be filling another specific use. Sometimes that may be as simple as just covering the soil, taking up space, but often they're going to serve other purposes like fixing nitrogen, which means that we use them as kind of a slow-release fertilizer, or maybe something that's useful for fiber or a building material or something to that effect. Yeah, nobody tuning in. Hello out there. Hey there, I see somebody. I have my comments up. Are we sounding okay? Is connection all right? You could type in chat, let me know. I'm going to see if anybody else jumps in, but we'll get started here in just a moment. Hey, Christy. Glad to see you. Hope everything's sounding all right. I got a little connection message there that our internet was not strong, but it looks all right on my end. So we'll go ahead. We're going to dive into it. Cool. Thank you. Thanks for the feedback. So talking about designing for abundance, food forests, and edible landscapes, I'm going to continue with the trend where I've been kind of visiting our permaculture principles and the permaculture ethics. That's something both myself and our other site manager, Corey, a lot of our gardening style and methodology is guided by the permaculture principles as much as possible. And so that's 3 ethics: care for the earth, care for people, and fair share. So equitability, being conscious about our environmental impact, and then obviously the goal of growing nutritious food is we're trying to care for people, us in particular, the food insecure of Carson City. And with those ethics, there's 12 principles that are to be kept in mind when designing these systems. Creatively use and respond to change, observe and interact, catch and store energy, obtain a yield, self-regulate and accept feedback, use and value renewables, produce no waste, design from pattern to detail, that's a big one for us today, integrate, capitalize on how things work together, use small and slow solutions, use and value diversity, and one of my favorites and another important one for today is use edges, so value the marginal space. The reason behind that is because places where we have different, in our context, we're talking about, ecosystems or growing areas. The places where those intersect, so like forest edge, meadow edge, shrub area into herbaceous, those areas of intersection are the places of highest biodiversity because you have organisms from both sides starting to overlap. And so we're capitalizing on the resilience that diversity brings us in our landscapes, and particularly when we talk about pest management and not using chemicals. That's very important as well. So today, with this discussion, we're going to focus on using and valuing that edge, using and valuing diversity, integrating rather than segregating, catch and store energy. That's what we're doing with food. And then we'll talk about some of the other plants, like those nitrogen fixers, and really anything that we're going to be using as a biomass plant in the system. That's storing that sunlight in a place where maybe we can't grow food, and then we're going to give that to our food-producing plants. So that's the way we're looking at it. All of these plants are photosynthesizing machines, and they're storing that energy that, if we're going to compost or give back to other plants or eat ultimately, it's storing the energy for our use in the future. Creatively use and respond to change. We'll talk about that, how some of these landscapes may mature over time or how we may want to stage them. We're mostly going to be talking about perennial food crops. However, when they're young and establishing, there's lots of extra room to utilize annuals and some of our more familiar vegetable crops during establishment when we have that space. And that location and that space will change over time as things get bigger and those spaces get shaded out, if that makes sense. And we'll obviously dive deeper. And then produce no waste. That's also in line with that. Everything in the system, we don't want anything producing any waste that we're going to get rid of. And really the whole design concept here is that, if you have a landscape right now where something's going in a brown bin or landscape waste going to waste management, that's stored energy that we want to be returning to the system. So we'll talk about how to look at those yard wastes as stored energy to go back into the system. So when we talk about food forests, the main concept is that we're looking at all the layers that you'd find in a typical forest. Because of our location here in the arid high desert, northern Nevada, if anybody's tuning in from out of town, we're in Carson City. The foothill garden here is approximately 5,000 foot elevation. So we may kind of be lacking in some of our systems, particularly if we're on the home scale, one of these layers. But the layers are what we'd find in a traditional forest, which is like an apex ecosystem in the wild. We have a canopy, which is going to be our tall tree layer. That's the one that sometimes we may be lacking. Up here, we luckily have some large cottonwoods and willow trees to our western edge, so we get a little bit of canopy layer, although it's far enough away, it doesn't really count within the site. And because we're using dwarf and semi-dwarf trees, we're really working with our understory layer primarily. And a lot of smaller food forests may be lacking that canopy layer. So you've got canopy into understory, which is your shorter trees, maybe very tall shrubs, down into your shrub layer, your bush height plants, down into your herb layer or your herbaceous layer. So that's going to be low growing, well, relatively low growing plants. A lot of our annual vegetables would fall either into that herbaceous or shrub layer. And then we've got our ground cover. So that's really our low growing stuff, clovers, strawberries, things like that, covering the soil, growing underneath everything. Many of those being tolerant of partial shade. Then we've got our root layer. And so that's something, producing tubers or corms or storage roots. Carrots, potatoes, sweet potatoes, horseradish is a great perennial one that makes sense for us to utilize around here. And even in just rattling those off, you can see how the root layer is not necessarily different from the herbaceous layer. You may have a root plant that's also filling that herbaceous layer. What we'll want to think about is what's happening underground. So right now we're thinking about the above soil layers. But if we think about how the roots can interact, we may be able to put an herbaceous layer plant that makes a big fat root, and maybe it's a skinny top like a carrot. We may be able to put that very close to a more fibrous rooted plant that maybe grows a bit taller. We can think about how those can interact together, and we may be able to tuck some roots in spaces that otherwise we'd think of as full. And then the last layer is the vine or the climbing layer, which is another challenging one for our area, particularly for food producers. We've only got a couple options, and then the management of those options can be difficult. But then we've got a couple ornamental options that we can look at, and then think about the management and the pruning of those seasonally, again, going back to the soil and feeding our soil. So, ivy or Virginia creeper, something like that, managing it on the trees, bringing that back down and using it as chop and drop mulch on the ground, or putting it into a compost system. So essentially what we're looking at is trying to fill all of these layers rather than just picking 2 or 3 of them. Often we see folks in the landscape, they're going to pick their understory, shrub, and either ground cover or herb layer and entirely ignore the other ones. And what that does is it's missed opportunity to catch and store more energy in the landscape because we have an abundance of sun. And so if we're not catching and utilizing that, it's either wasted or it's going to grow undesirables. So there's much more opportunity for weeds to develop when we don't fill all of these layers, particularly the ground cover. The best way to combat weeds in an area is going to be to plant something in its place that's desirable and manageable. So some favorite edibles, well, I guess the favorite edible for me as far as ground cover goes is strawberry. They spread well. With a little bit of attention and management of weeds, they do a good job of kind of choking out weeds and preventing them themselves. Other great options, clover is a nitrogen fixer. So nitrogen fixers grow using atmospheric nitrogen from the air rather than nitrogen found in the soil. They're not pumping that nitrogen directly to other plants and feeding or fertilizing them, which sometimes people think is how that's working. But what they're doing, yeah, we could make sure. Hey, come here, pretty girl. Come here, pretty girl. We got a pup on site. They are utilizing the atmospheric nitrogen through the assistance of bacteria in the roots that store that nitrogen, and the plant uses it to grow itself. So all of that nitrogen and nutrition is stored in those root nodules and in the biomass of the plant. So it's not fertilizing or feeding other plants around it until you cut it back and return some of that biomass to the soil. Now, it's not just through the pruning and the decomposition of that above ground plant material, whether it's dropped on the ground as mulch and decomposing over time, or whether it's through compost. But also when you prune those plants, some of those roots are going to die off and be released to the soil because the plant can no longer support them after the pruning. And so that is feeding the soil and the surrounding plants below ground. So you do have both actions going on when we utilize nitrogen fixers. So you can think about utilizing clover as a ground cover, even if it's managed as a lawn. Every time it's mowed or weed whacked, you're going to get that release of green plant matter on top that's going to break down over time, but you're also getting a root release that feeds the soil, and when that dies off, it's going to allow a little bit of space for oxygen and water to penetrate. So it does wonderful things for the soil and the surrounding plants. However, you have to essentially abuse or chop those plants at some point for that action to happen. As far as our root layer goes, mentioned some of those annual root crops that we're familiar with, like potatoes. Sweet potatoes are pretty challenging here, but carrots, radishes, beets, all of those are great options. They do really well. Most of them, potatoes aside, do great in our shoulder season, so spring and fall, when sometimes it's a challenge to have other things growing. So one of the strategies is that if you're planting, say, new fruit trees, you're going to be watering and doing your irrigation primarily around the drip line of the trees, that edge of the crown where if we were to get rain or overhead water, most of it would be dripping down and leaving that dry soil. That's where we water, and so that's also your edge where you could be cultivating some shallow rooted root crops. And then as season after season, as the tree's getting bigger, you're moving that ring of cultivation out. Integrating, aside from food crops, that's also a good opportunity for herbaceous plants that maybe are going to serve pest management services. So lots of these videos, lots of these discussions, we talk about the benefit of varieties, a diverse variety of different flower shapes and flower types flowering throughout the year. And the reason for that is because of the insects they attract and the pest management services they provide for us. So again, that sweet spot around the crown of these trees is a great place to be doing some of that cultivation. Now, when we're considering perennial herbaceous layer plants, perennial shrubs, small trees, tall shrubs under larger trees, those things we need to consider permanent location. So when we're designing, those are plants that need to be permanently located at the, mature drip line, or crown edge of those trees. So we can't be planning to put them close and then moving them as they grow, because we don't want to be constantly transplanting those. That's strictly for our annual vegetables. That's just an opportunity to grow those in the system as it's developing. But that's something where we need to be looking at if we're planting a small semi-dwarf fruit tree that's only this big around. Ultimately, it's going to have, a 10 or 12 foot diameter. That's where we need to be planting our understory plants and those shrubs and things that are going to grow into perpetuity. But that gap in between, in the meantime, that's an opportunity to grow other things there. And we're probably going to be, our irrigation may be split for the establishment of both of those things anyway. So that's what we're looking at design-wise. So as far as more examples of plant species go, understory, those trees, that's going to be our semi-dwarf. That's going to be all our fruit trees. So around here, the real winners, apples are probably the most consistent. Cherries, and pears are probably next in line, but all of those stone fruits, so peaches and plums, depending on variety, certainly have a place. Cherries, apples, pears, apricots, and that means some of the hybrids do well also. When selecting those varieties, mulberries are worth mention as well. We've had good success with establishing some of those this season, and they're abundant producers. They make a lot of sense in these systems. Trying to think if there's anything glaring I'm missing on those fruit trees. When selecting varieties for those trees and our fruit trees in general, the main thing that we want to look at is chill hours. So you're going to see nurseries listing chill hours, usually 200, maybe 1 or 150, but all the way up to 700, 800. Usually not much more than that. For our area, we typically want to be looking at 500 or more chill hours. And what that is that's the quantity of cold time. I don't know if it's actually all sub-freezing, but cold hours before the tree breaks dormancy. And so we want varieties that are going to spend some time, as long as possible dormant before flowering out, because we're so susceptible to that late spring frost that often kills our blossoms. So that's what we're looking for with those. If you happen to see a variety, obviously, that says late to flower, early to ripen, that's ideal. That's what we're looking for. Chill hours are really the important guideline if those specific traits aren't mentioned. The other consideration is making sure some of those trees need different varieties for proper pollination. So I know cherries, I think some of our pears are like that, but that's definitely something to consider and make sure you have those pollinators in there. For one of our vining species, that's important as well. Hardy kiwis need pollinators. So our shrub layer, that could be some true, like dwarf, very small fruit trees, although that's primarily going to be our berry bushes. Those are going to be our main fruiters in that shrub layer. So the familiar ones that do well in the area are the compound fruit berries, raspberries, blackberries, mulberries are a tree version of those. But those tend to do well. Blueberries can do well once the soil is amended properly. They typically like acidic soils, and our soils are resistant to acidifying. So that can be very challenging, although some folks do have success. I don't recommend it because of the challenges, and I think the best alternative is called honeyberry. It's a fruiting honeysuckle species, and it produces sometimes relatively large, like bell-shaped berries, and they're very, very similar in taste to blueberries. And what's great about the shrub is it does well in our soils. The flowers are extremely frost hardy, down to negative 30 or 40 degrees or something crazy. So they do really well. We've had good success with them up here. I think they are going to do better once the climate where they're planted is ameliorated and buffered a little bit by some of the surrounding trees. They are pretty much full sun, and I think they would have been a better partial shade candidate. And I have a couple that would have been a good trade for those, but several of them were experimental. So in addition to those familiars, honeyberry I think is the best blueberry alternative. Goji berries, which are becoming more and more familiar with people, and they're in that superfood category. They happen to do really well in our climate. As far as quantity of production, we're still working on figuring out their fertilization and water requirements to really get them cranking. But all of the examples that we have planted up here were from young bare root specimens and are just now 2 or 3 years old. So we're just starting to see that first production this year and last season. So we anticipate much more in the next couple years. In addition to goji, currants and gooseberries both do well, and we do have a couple native currant options. There's both a red and a yellow or golden currant that are true natives. Another one that's been pretty successful, and last season was probably the most productive of any of those shrubs. Was it's called Goumi, Goumi, and it's a fruiting Elaeagnus species, and it's known, not well known, but it's known for being one of the best plant sources of lycopene, which is that prostate cancer preventing compound that we're familiar with being in tomatoes. I'm pretty sure that one's also a nitrogen fixer, so that's pretty cool. And there's not a lot of food producing nitrogen fixing options, and it's also semi-evergreen, so it keeps its leaves most of the year, and if we have mild winter time, it'll keep them. So really great one. We may be able to do a quick walkabout at the end and show a couple quick close-ups on some of those ones we have up here. So the Goumi is a great one, and then elderberry is another good one. We mostly have black elderberry varietals from European or East Coast cultivars. We have a couple native ones. We have a native blue one out here in our area, and we also have a native red, if I'm not mistaken, although I don't think that one has food use. I think that one is toxic, so we just want to be using black and blue elderberry. But that's a great one, and that could almost fill the understory role. If anybody's familiar with elderberry, that can get relatively tall. So another great candidate for our climate. Likes a decent amount of water, but can do very well. So for our herb layer, our herbaceous layer, that can be anything from a 6 or 8 inch lettuce plant all the way up to something that's waist or chest high. So that's going to be a lot of our ornamental flowers, familiar landscaping plants, and familiar vegetables would all fall into that category. Good perennial candidates for the long term. If you have a good moist spot that's somewhat buffered from our baking afternoon sun, asparagus can do really well in our areas and can last a really long time, producing year after year. Artichokes, I think, are a great candidate because of their size. So, talking about covering space to prevent weeds from pushing in, covering the soil. Artichokes are a great big plant, produce a beautiful flower, even if you don't eat the artichoke. Rhubarb is another great one, that most folks are familiar with. Takes up a decent amount of space and is useful season after season. It's also got toxic leaf material that gets returned to, your compost pile or the soil. We're only using the stalks on that one. So, and as far as, back to the roots, the only good perennial option that I'm really familiar with is horseradish. And that's a good one to set up as kind of a perimeter because it's perennial and it can grow pretty aggressively where there's water, but you're knocking back its space or limiting its area every harvest because it's a root crop. So by harvesting the root, you're kind of keeping in place. But it's a good barrier, kind of barrier plant in the ground. Bulbs are another great barrier. So that root layer can be a good barrier for rhizomious grasses and whatnot. So those fill a really good ground cover role. And anything that's going to produce flowers like that, that's valuable for our pollinators. So we'll jump a little more into flower types and styles for the pollinator health and pollinator habitat. So a lot of that's relevant to our shrub layer as well. And the ones I'm overlooking on the note of flowers with the shrub and herb layer is our familiar perennial culinary herbs. So oregano, rosemary, thyme, varying heights, but pretty much shrub layer. Those flowers, because they're tiny and clustered, those are great for our tiny predatory insects. And so tiny pests are flowers. That's the favorite for predators of those. So thyme, sweet alyssum. Sweet alyssum is an annual, but it self-seeds regularly. Oregano. Some of the mints, although they can spread very aggressively, but those flower styles are great for those. So integrating those in your shrub and herb layer is very wise. Parsley, cilantro, those are annuals, but they self-seed regularly enough that they fit the bill as well. One of the goals with some of these ground covers, herb layer stuff, if you're not choosing a true perennial or can't fill up all the space, letting things go to seed and spread, so that instead of going out and having to pick weeds, maybe you're thinning parsley and cilantro and alyssum and arugula and lettuce and things that you're letting spread better than going out and pulling some of the nasty weeds that we get, spiky ones that are going to blow around and things like that. So shifting that is a good strategy that you can plan for. And then the vine climbing layer, we've got grapes and hardy kiwi. I've had some difficulty establishing the hardy kiwi up here. Part of that being planting time and receiving plants that had broken dormancy when we were still cold up here, and so they got refrozen, but then we're still trying to grow. So I'm hoping to be able to source plant material in the fall this year to plant in the dormant season, so hopefully it will break later. Although a couple did survive. They're not growing particularly well yet, but we will see how they continue over time. But grapes, we know, can do well in our area. They do grow vigorously enough that I have some concerns about allowing them to grow up fruit trees and that management. So that's something that's kind of we see taught in these food forest setups. I haven't seen it in practice and figured out how the management really works. So I don't know if that would be wise, but there may be a place for it. To have one of these vines growing in a fruit tree and getting the production of both together. But I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. So I am more of a proponent of utilizing those climbing species on fences and providing windbreaks, shade buffering, and things like that, and kind of using them wisely in the landscape to perform ecological service. But I don't know about putting them up in the fruit trees. If anybody has ever experimented with that, or if anybody's come across an old fruit tree that's maybe overgrown and had to reclaim one from a grapevine, those would be interesting stories to hear how they're doing now. So, all right. So, and feel free to chime in with questions, particularly any species-specific stuff. Yeah, I think I can show you a little bit, Christy. We are, I'm on laptop right here, but I think we can do a quick walk for the last like 5 or 10 and just show you close-ups on the plants. They're relatively spread out and still somewhat immature, but I think the style will make sense. So, and the gojis, they come from a similar climate in Western Asia. I think it's like the Mongolian steppe area, which is also where our lovely invasive cheatgrass comes from. So talking about, I think that's a good coverage on species and strategy. So I want to talk about some implementation strategies of a way to approach this if you were looking at taking back a lawn, or taking a bare space, or a weedy space, or a traditionally landscaped space, and trying to convert it to something like this. With perennials, and particularly with our soils being alkaline and resistant to acidifying, and most of these plants liking a neutral or slightly acidic pH, the best thing that we can do is avoid and minimize tillage and minimize soil disturbance. That allows fungi to be the dominant microbial group in the soil, or at least to start shifting towards that, as opposed to our traditionally bacterially dominated soils. And the byproduct of fungi breaking things down in the soil is humic acid, so they acidify over time. So minimizing tillage and organic mulches on the surface, adding organic matter to the surface, are going to be best friends, or our best strategies. And if you've tuned in before, I talk about kind of 4 primary principles that we use to drive our organic farming style. One of them is armor the soil. So that's kind of where our mulch comes in. Minimizing tillage is one of them, so minimizing that disturbance. Living roots in the soil as long as possible. So we'll talk about the potential of cover crops to do this, and that's also kind of how the annuals fit in the picture, talking about moving them season after season. That's living roots in the soil, where otherwise we probably wouldn't be doing that, establishing a perennial system like this. If we're not going to do annual vegetables, then we could do cover crops. We can do something that's going to terminate seasonally with the cold or the heat, like cereal grasses and things like that. That's going to get living roots in the soil. They're going to capture and store energy in those roots, and then we're going to, either terminate them, or they'll terminate with the climate conditions. And that's all feeding the soil, and that's all going to benefit the system that we're planting. And then the last one is crop rotation. So that doesn't really fit in this, considering it's a perennial system and it's not traditional farming, but it's diverse enough that you almost get the benefits of crop rotation without actually rotating. And I even talk about that, how a lot of the time we get our rotation over time by sequencing things throughout the season and not really ever letting something go fallow, instead of actually rotating through space. So, one bed may have tomatoes season after season, but between the tomato crops, it's going to have, a lettuce crop going into the fall, and then an overwintered carrot, and then we'll run a quick radish before we plant tomatoes again in the spring. And so that changeover gives us the same benefits and disease breakup that crop rotation by actually moving it bed to bed would give us. So I'm a big fan of sheet mulching. There's a part of me that wishes I had sheet mulched more thoroughly up on this site, and really space and labor was the restriction there. So sheet mulching also sometimes, or similar to lasagna gardening, often utilizes cardboard or newspaper in mass amounts to be the first layer to cover the soil. It's great for suppressing weeds or lawn, turf grass, basically smothering it with something that's going to break down over time and feed the soil. A similar alternative would be occultation or solarization, which would be using plastic to the same purpose, black plastic, and starving the plants and soil of sunlight is occultation. Solarization is using clear plastic where you get sunlight, and then that actually gives you the greenhouse effect, and you actually cook that soil. The benefits of solarization is that you often will get sterilization of weed seeds in that top layer because it gets hot enough. Also, you're going to sterilize microorganisms. So that can be good or bad. Typically, we're going to consider that an undesirable, killing all those microbes, although it's typically not too deep, so it may not be an issue. If there's been plant disease issues in the area, that could be a benefit, cooking that soil and solarizing it. Otherwise, typically occultation's preferred for what it's going to do to the microbial life of the soil. It's killing by starving it of sunlight. And then you've got kind of a blank slate to work with. It looks ugly while you're doing it, and it's using a big piece of plastic, so those are kind of the negatives, but it's probably less labor than layering cardboard or newspaper. So those, I think those are the best options. Otherwise, it's kind of traditional planting methods, tilling, mulch, which, tilling and clearing or using landscape fabric, I'm not the biggest fan of, especially for the long term. So sheet mulching, laying down cardboard, typically one layer is good as long as you do good overlap. Sometimes you may want to do 2 layers if you have something particularly aggressive that you're trying to suppress or you're concerned about. And then what you do is you layer your area with that material or several layers of newspaper. And you cover that area, and then you have a choice of layering raw compost materials, which would be kind of like the lasagna gardening method, where you rotate layers of greens or high nitrogen plant material. The exception to the green is that manure would be considered a green there. And then you alternate that with layers of brown. And you need to end up with about double the amount of brown that you have of green. And the brown is our high carbon layer. So that would be leaves, straw, shredded paper, wood chips, things like that. So to get the 2 to 1, we do, a 1 or 2 inch layer of that high nitrogen material, grass clippings, food scraps, although in a big space for what we're doing, food scraps may not be the best. But, manure, green plant material, grass clippings, those are probably going to be the best choice. And then, 1 to 2 inches of that, and then 2 to 4 inches, a thicker layer of your brown, whatever your high carbon material is. Do a couple layers of that, and then you've got a nice, after a season or two, with appropriate moisture, that's going to be nice, chunky compost soil kind of stuff. Or alternatively, on top of your cardboard, you could go directly and purchase compost or topsoil of some sort, and skip some of the composting in place. The trade-off there is that you're paying for it, right? Obviously, that's going to give quicker results. You could probably plant straight into that, so you'd lay down that soil, topsoil or compost, and then still cover it with an organic mulch, a straw or a wood chip. My favorite is mixed arborist mulch from tree trimming companies with some leaf material in it, but that's just chipped wood from our native trees. It will often have some tree seed and things like that in it, so it's just something to be aware of. The first couple seasons, you may be getting, little seedlings popping up that are not from your surrounding trees. Just the nature of the management and the weeding over those first couple seasons. I think that those kind of things popping up are much easier to manage and less detrimental if you miss them those first couple seasons than a lot of our other weeds that would be popping up if we hadn't sheet mulched, right? And so then once you've got that done, then, depending on how the strategy you've chosen, you may need to wait a season or two for some of that to mature. But typically, if you do something like this in the fall or winter, then come springtime, if you're ready to plant, or ideally, if you can do fall planting, it's always better in our area. So then you go back, wherever you're going to be planting, you move your mulch and your composting material and either cut a hole or pop an X down in your cardboard or your layer and plant in there. And then basically what we've done is suppressed anything from growing, so you know with relative reliability that you're only going to be getting weeds that blow in or in your mulch, or they're going to be growing up out of those little planting holes where you put things, and so you'll have to go and weed around those little plants. So assuming you're planting things and planning for the mature size of the landscape. When you're plugging in your understory trees and your shrubs and maybe vines or climbers, we're probably going to have a bunch of open space. So that's where we need to be looking at, if we're going to plug in perennial herbaceous layer stuff, figure out where those homes are, but then all that empty space between them that they're going to mature into, that's where we can be broadcasting seed of our permanent ground covers. So, planting out strawberries in some of those gaps and knowing that they're going to spread when they start putting their runners out. Broadcasting clover seed or, creeping thyme, or, transplanting small plants out, filling those spots in with those things that could be permanent, or also that's where we can go in and, make a little 2x4, 2x6 garden bed, do a little loosening with a fork and plant some annual vegetables in that space. So that's kind of the strategy there. I think sheet mulching is really the way to go when looking at a space like this, or looking at installing a system like this. But it depends on your context. Depends what you're trying to do. So, yeah, I think I see your questions, Christy. Let me catch up. No, that's very unlikely, and I don't know what kind of fungus killed your grass, and there'd be some questions on watering habits, and some things there to figure out what's going on, but there's a good chance that, that's just going to be great for that soil and for other plants. Depends on some factors, but no, it shouldn't be ruined, and you shouldn't think about that. And no, tainting a compost pile with fungus, it's full of different fungus and microbiology. They're doing a lot of the work for us. That's one of the areas with your compost pile, you trust your nose. So bad fungi and bad things, although typically when a compost pile goes bad or anaerobic, it's going to be a bacterial problem. And that's going to produce the foul smell. Hey, Jake. So bad fungus in a compost pile, I almost say doesn't exist. As far as whether the fungus on your grass, if it killed the grass, whether that could be a problem for future plants or not, that's a good question. I don't know for sure. But again, I think following some of these strategies, sheet mulching, introducing organic matter, getting roots in the soil, all of those things are going to help. And replacing the lawn, which is a monoculture, one species all over the place, with resilience, so that even if there was a pathogenic fungus in that soil that was going to damage something, it's probably only going to damage one or two types of those plants and not everything, and will probably be healed in short order with that kind of diversity in the ground. Okay, so fairy ring mushrooms, sometimes that may not be, the fungus may not have killed the lawn. That could have been the mycelial mat. And Jake might want to chime in too. He's one of my mushroom nerd friends, and we use the term nerd endearingly. So sometimes the mycelium grows so thick that I think it chokes out and starves the grass of moisture and or oxygen. I don't think it actually diseases it. But I'm not super familiar with those, and they're relatively rare in our area. So that would be something where if you were doing evening watering, shifting to morning watering, it could be as simple as that. And just getting, because then you're getting that relatively quick evaporation after moisture as opposed to it sitting overnight. But if you're going to get rid of the lawn anyway, I think that's great. And I think there's, you know, some of what we're talking about with the ground cover stuff and mixing flowers and clover and sweet alyssum and some of that stuff. I think it could be managed almost like a lawn. And I think it would perform great ecological services. It may not be quite as nice to go lay down on and like sit and picnic, although clover's pretty sweet like that. But I think there's definitely some potential there to have kind of a multi-species hybrid kind of turf, you know, that's not just grass. So that makes, yeah, that could be good. And if it, shoot us a message, Christy, and give me some more details. So I'd like to talk through that strategy more if you're interested in converting that. That could be fun, and it may be as simple as aerating and seeding with some other stuff instead of sheet mulching. If it's already choked out your grass, you know, turf grass is usually one of the toughest things to get back after. So you might be a step ahead because of the fairy friends. So we'll take a quick little walk and see what the visibility is like with the screen here, and see if I can show y'all a couple of our plant examples up in our, you know, it's kind of a barren little corner, but there's some cool stuff going on. So, and this is my coworker Amy's computer, so I'm gonna make sure I don't drop it. So this is, let me get the angle. So this is our little kind of perennial corner. So the steps behind me, this one closest to me, right behind here, this is the Eleagnus. So they actually didn't really fruit, and I think it was the blossoms getting toasted by that late frost, which I know some of our fruit trees, the pear pulled through, but our little plum didn't. I know the west side of town, some cherry trees that were full last year, most of the blossoms got burnt, so didn't fruit, but really pretty plant. This is the Gumi, or the Eleagnus, so it's got kind of silvery underside of the leaves, nice red bark, and it's a fruit producer and a nitrogen fixer. So here's a couple. They're relatively sad on this little slope, but they're also young, just planted last year. Sorry, let me get my angle right. This is a little elderberry coming along right here. Got another little one right at the top with that grass right next to it. So another little elderberry. The ones that have been probably the most reliable, although they're not super bountiful, although we'll see how they do over time, is the gooseberry. So they're thorny plant, but they're I'm pretty sure they're a currant and something else hybrid, but there's lots of gooseberries that do well. There's another gooseberry right there. So here's what I'm talking about. We've got tucked up here, this is an oregano behind me. So that's those tiny flower clusters. Just over here, oh, visibility is a little tough, huh? That's, you know, a thyme bush down here. This is clary sage. This is a perennial, medicinal, great pollinator plant, spreads readily, does well in our area, so it's a great, you know, great herb, tall herb layer plant. You know, this is a flowering parsley that's just kind of spreading on its own. There's a sage plant, that's just regular culinary green sage. So you can see we've got all that stuff kind of tucked around and spreading. These, let's see if I can get the angle. Down here, you know, I've got clary sage that these are just volunteers coming up on their own. And then you can see I've also got clover down here. So we've got a lot of clover that's been growing up here. And this is so this is not a fruit producing tree, but this is a Siberian pea shrub. So this is a nitrogen fixer. This is here just for abuse. This is growing next to, I've got a young little mulberry down here. So it's planted to the east of the pea shrub, so the pea shrub gives it a little shade from that baking western sunset, and ultimately the pea shrub roots are going to make it over here, and so when we hack back and abuse that pea shrub, we're going to be feeding this soil in this area. So that pea shrub is there to be abused for the sake of this mulberry tree. So, and you can see looking behind me, you know, it's thin, it's not filled out, but you can see we've got some perennial sunflower up over here. And I think you can make sense of the strategy we're going for. Down here, this is what the honeyberry looks like. Oops, sorry, the angle's tough with the computer. So that's our honeyberry, and then right into another goomy right there. Another very, very sad elderberry there. We've got a pea shrub tucked in here on the other side of that goomy. Another elderberry there. And then here's our goji. And the gojis are spindly. You can see we've got a couple new sprouts, but that's kind of their style. You can see this, here's one that's a year older and more mature. And it's got, can I get the berries? You can see a couple little berries on there. So this, you know, produced a couple last year, a few this year, but really, you know, it's just starting to produce. You can see here on the honeyberries too, I did get a little bit, I don't know if we can make them out. There's little leftovers of some tiny berries. They really weren't big or enough to be worth donating this season. So we're gonna try and fertilize them and see if we can crank some big berries out of those over in the next couple years. So I'll show you. I don't have haven't planted any fruit trees up there yet. I've got all our fruit trees up here at the Foothill Garden working over on this other slope. And I think we're about time. I don't know if I'm going over, but so let me get. So you can see this is a peach tree behind me. Got another peach tree in the cage over there. And I've got, you know, fruit tree. Got a couple more cages tucked in over here. So, you know, we put all 12 of those in this year. And this one, I'll show you how we did a little bit of cover crop underneath this season. So you can see this is an apple here behind. And then we've got all this stuff growing down underneath. Kind of make out, see a little bit of purple flower there. That's a hairy vetch. This is buckwheat. This is all hairy vetch climbing up. We had some kind of, I think it was a cowpea, like a broad bean. But since we had these little micro sprinklers over here for our irrigation for establishment on these, broadcast a bunch of seed around. So and you can see some of it spreading around. We've got clary sage that's spread along the hillside. Down here, you know, there's arugula in the mix. I'll come over periodically and bust off the dry seed heads, and we're gonna get regrowth down with that little sprinkler there, and just letting that stuff spread. And over time, you know, if it's starting to get too close to the trunk, we'll come in and just chop it down. So that hairy vetch is a nitrogen fixer, so we chop and drop, leave it in place, and you can see the whole slope behind. I've let sunflowers go, so we're really just trying to get all kinds of diversity in the mix, and that stuff's not going to compete with our trees and our perennials because they're annuals. You know, we have to manage and pay a little bit of attention that things aren't getting choked out early on peak growing season, but those things are mostly benefiting the soil and the plants around rather than really competing with them. So I think that's all I got for you folks. Thank you very much for tuning in. Any other questions before we disconnect? I appreciate y'all checking in. And yeah, like I said, we're going to continue doing these live broadcasts, but we're hoping to get back in the routine of having folks come up here live in person. So I know it's smoky today and not the best day for it, but please, if you're able and interested, come visit in person next month, and we look forward to it. Thanks, Jackie. Getting caught up. August isn't too late for spring cleaning, right? All right, thanks a lot, folks. Have a great day. Stay out of the smoke. Good luck out there. And we'll be at market, of course, tomorrow, so hope to see y'all bright and early. We'll be selling bouquets.